Okay, welcome again, everyone, for I think the fifth or sixth iteration of this webcast series on epistemologies of land. We already had a great number of speakers, and today it's going to be a little different because we have an archaeologist in the house. Thank you all very much for joining, even though it's Friday afternoon and quite warm outside, very sunny here in Berlin. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining anyway. The talk today is delivered by Eduardo Machicado, who is a Queen's postdoctoral research associate in archaeology, and he also has a PhD in archaeology from the University of Cambridge. We actually also met in Cambridge, having a very, how would I say, enthusiastic night talking about land. And everybody else was totally weirded out by us getting so overly enthusiastic about land. So I thought, okay, we do have to come up with something on the topic. So I'm very happy, Eduardo, that this is it. And your talk
ended up in this volume, right?
Yeah, it was quite long. Your talk is entitled "A Tale of Two Swamps: Meditations on the Epistemology of the Drained Environment." And yeah, as the others before you, you have about 20-25 minutes to introduce what you want to do, and then we can discuss in the group. Thank you again very much for joining us, and enjoy.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to give the talk in the first place. As Felix was mentioning, I'm an archaeologist, and most of my work is very empirical. But I thought it was like a good opportunity to share with you like some ideas that I've been having through like different projects and over a long period of time, and just get some feedback on that. So I think one of the important things is that you take this. I don't have the aspiration for these to be a scientific work, really. It's more like, you know, an exercise in deductive logic, and sort of like an attempt to make some cross like cultural comparisons in order to reach not necessarily to reach a conclusion, because if you read the paper you see it's not exactly going to have a final answer to the question. But one of the things that I heavily criticize archaeologists is about their lack of imagination, because we have very limited, most archaeologists have like a very limited range on what are the possibilities of certain environments and what are the possibilities of certain interpretations. And I think we would benefit quite a lot from sort of engaging in these type of discussions. So I'm going to start sharing my some slides. There's a lot of images. I think it's just like makes it easier to understand. So, okay. So what is like the problem that I'm trying to tackle? I think from the very beginning of the history of anthropology, and its relationship with archaeology, one of the biggest questions has been the problem of political authority, right? And political authority understood in the terms of the levels of political integration. So from the very beginning, the ideas in anthropology was to classify societies according to their level of integration, as is the very famous model of Lewis Henry Morgan of savages, barbarians, and civilization. This idea obviously was heavily criticized in the earlier 20th century, but I find the problem just keeps coming back in different forms, in different shades. We in a previous talk, we also talk about the influence of Marxist ideas on the idea of political integration, and how these entered the archaeological industry through the work of Gordon Childe. And moving from anthropology to archaeology is how can we first describe these, but a much more important question is how did it develop? We know that there's a period in which there was no political integration, let's say, and then nowadays we live in a world that is very, very integrated. So what was like the steps that like took us there? And yeah, most of these was like sort of tackled from a Marxist perspective, and I think it connects to different talks that have been given in the previous like occasions. I think a last theoretical iteration of this is the work of Julian Stewart, and how like in the 50s there's like sort of a new wave of like ideas trying to connect political integration from a more like evolutionary point of view, like sort of taking like some ideas from biological from like ecology and biological anthropology to describe like these events. Now, in terms of the archaeology and the archaeology of landscape, one of like the, let's call it correlates of like political integrations has always been monumentality, right? The idea that there's like these massive monuments was like one of the markers that there was like some form of political integration. And we know this happens like everywhere in the world, like this is not like uncommon, and it still like sort of feels a lot of like our imagination about what political integration means. And it's also another point that has been like touched in previous like interventions, the idea of, you know, the good king, like building, like, or feeding people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, in the discussion of like the land, what is called like sort of landscapes of power, there are particular forms of monumentality in which we have focused that are like directly connected to the idea of political authority. Royal tombs, like what we interpret as like sort of public buildings, like fortresses, that kind of thing. Despite this, we know this happens cross-culturally all over the world. We have monuments everywhere in the world, like people have been doing this. Like one of the regions in which like this has been quite a problem is like Amazonia, like in the Amazon forest. Like tropical forests have always been like sort of in this like gray area about like if there was or there wasn't political integration. What does this mean in ecological terms, or in terms of like some of the idea of social evolution? And I find it's really interesting in the sense that when I teach this class, I like to show like, this is the poster of a movie called Amazonia. But I think one of the reasons like the discussion about like political integration in the Amazon has been like so complicated is because there is like a very strong idea about like tropical environments that is rooted in our head, that is like very difficult to disaggregate. It's very difficult to move beyond that because it's like so entrenched in our imagination. I put like these posters specifically because this movie that came out, I think 2007, so around 2007, is a movie of about the Amazon forest, but there's no people in it, right? It is a movie about animals in the Amazon, and people, you know, are not present. And I thought it was like quite interesting. Because obviously the idea that we have of people in the Amazon forest is like this kind of picture, right? Which is like, well, these are the Nunak. It's like the idea of like sort of naked people living in the forest, like having like very little impact, like closer more to some form of animality, or like to a certain extent, like sort of living attuned into this sort of metaphoric idea that we have about what nature really means compared to what like civilization means. I'm not going to enter too much in detail this when I teach like my lessons, when I lecture, I go into much more detail on this. I try to avoid using the idea of the colonial gaze because I prefer to use the word colonial is like being very charged nowadays. It has like very different, like very specific meanings. But it's definitely a result of modernity, and this is one of the things I really like to stress. Like the idea that we have Amazonia is something that starts, we can trace like so the genealogy of like these ideas to like the Industrial Revolution and to a very specific like sort of side of like literature that is connected with the development of the novel savage, right? Which is, I think it talks more about the anxieties of the European men and women in sort of the beginning of the century than an actual reality, like an empirical reality about political integration in places like the Amazon forest. So to cut it like a bit short, so for my dissertation, like I've been working in the Amazon for now like almost like 15 years. It was like one of my first jobs. And in the part of the Amazon forest that I work, it's like in northeastern Bolivia. And it's like a very interesting landscape where for many years there has been like this discussion of political integration, and we have like changing a lot of ideas about the history of indigenous people in the Amazon forest and their relationship with the environment. So one interesting thing about this part of the Amazon forest is like we're in a tropical savanna. We're in like the southern part of like the Amazon forest, and this landscape is divided roughly into two by this river in the middle, right? And we have been working very actively in the area around here that is called Monte San Pablo. And the reason we've been working in Monte San Pablo is because in the early 20th century, 1914 roughly, a Swedish explorer, Erland Nordenskiöld, started to sort of explore the area. It's like a very scantily populated part of Bolivia. And he started to describe the existence of these mounds, the idea of like these mounds, like these structures that were in the middle of the forest. Nobody knew who built them. Nobody knew what they were, but they were littered with archaeological material. So since 1914, all the way till now, like we've been like with different intensities and different times, like exploring like this part of the Amazon. And I've been working with the German Institute of Archaeology for quite a while. And not necessarily out of luck, but like when they were like building a road between Santa Cruz and Trinidad, there was like the chance to cut through one of like these mysterious mounds. So we excavated it, we mapped it in a very German fashion with like very detailed work. It took us like many years like to do it. But the results I think were like well, not necessarily surprising, but this has become like one of the strongest evidence we have of some form of a monumentality in the Amazon forest that is very difficult to argue against. So these mounds, what it turned out to be, is like they are actually square platforms, right? And they're like different levels of like these square platforms. And on top of that, on top of these platforms, we found like a U-shaped structure. And there is a rampart like surrounding it. This was work by Dr. Heiko Plumers. I was like part of the team like for many years. And when we started excavating this site, it was just forest. We couldn't see anything. The only reason we could see this is because we mapped it so detailedly. And when we were excavating, like on the top of like that of these, you have like this U-shaped structure. We were excavating around like this area. What we found is a cemetery, and in this cemetery, in the middle of this cemetery, we found like the skeleton of like this man who is, was very tall, very robust, like, I think it's like 180, years like tall, so really big bones. But what was like even more interesting is that he was buried with a pair of copper ear spools and a set of bone bracelets and 3 jaguar teeth on his chest. And if you look here in detail, what we are interpreting is like that he was probably had like some form of basket in like around like the knees, and it's littered with like beads and like all sorts of little things. But more interesting is that he was surrounded by other like people that each one had different sort of like symbols of power. Everyone like they were like decorated like pieces of bone. There were like one with a massive like sort of plate in the back. 3 children with flutes in their hands. So it was like, if we would have found these in another like place of the world, we would have thought about like this as some sort of royal tomb, right? And this is so far like the most unequivocal like evidence that we have that there was like some level of political integration, like some important level of political integration. Now, this is not an anomaly, actually. We know because of the dates that this is something that has been happening in several parts of the Americas. Like these structures are roughly like what it would be the Middle Ages in Europe. So it's not that they're early things; they're like quite late in the chronology. And this is a reconstruction of Cahokia, which is another really famous like earthen structure, like pyramid structure in North America in the Mississippi River. And we have very good evidence of like, this point of maximum expansion of political authority in sort of like the Americas around that time. So this is more like this is more what we're thinking about what it really, these structures looked like. And this is again based on Cahokia, but you can see it's just they're like built with mud bricks, so that's just they don't preserve like any other like monument, but they're clearly monuments, and they're clearly monuments of power. And there's definitely a sense of like social hierarchy and social structure. And we've done some analysis in different cemeteries, and we have like other lines of evidence that proves that. Now, what happened after we did this? We finished this in 2005. And for my dissertation, when I moved to Cambridge, what I did was I moved from Monte San Pablo into a different area, into the area of San Ignacio de Mojos. And the reason I did that was motivated by the fact that we have like very good evidence of many of these structures in Monte San Pablo, but none anywhere else. So there is like a sense of cultural variability. There is a sense of like different parts of the basin acting in different ways. And I was sent there to look for evidence and to connect one area with the other. I don't know if I succeeded to very much, but we did what we could. What was interesting about this area, though, is that despite there's no earthen structures, no pyramids, I mean, we can call it these pyramids, what there is like a massive investment in draining like these like different parts of the landscape. So this became evident in like 1940s when they started to take aerial photos of the area. But what they have is like, there's like vast expanses of agricultural fields and vast expanses of like drainage canals and all these like systems connected in some way or another. We started to sort of, through survey, we started like to map some of these canals. And you can see there are like some interesting, like very subtle, but when you map them, like very strange like structures, like very strange like configurations of like these canals. Like they like suggest like the existence of other types of sort of like sluices or maybe like dams, and they're clearly trying to move water from one point to the other. And there has been a lot of speculation of like what has been happening here. For my master's dissertation, and I've picked like a small area. It's like about like 100. It's like the size of Cambridgeshire, so a small area. But I took a motorcycle and I mapped everything that I could map. And you can see like sort of the density, all like these, the red triangles are like modern towns, but the circles are archaeological sites, so areas where I like found like evidence of some form of prehistoric like occupation. And on top of that, I mapped all like these drainage systems. One of the big questions that we were trying to tackle is like, so what were these really agricultural fields? I mean, we interpret them as agricultural fields, but were they agricultural fields? And there has been a bitter battle of how like they worked. So there's like this idea that they're like using the water like in the same way that they used it in Mexico, like with the Chinampa system. So they're trying to transfer fertility of the water to the soil. And there have been some experiments with these. All of them were a bit of failure. I took a much more Cambridge empirical approach and just cut through one of them and sort of look what they could tell me. And yeah, I found like very strong evidence, like micromorphological evidence that there are fields. Like these are like micromorphology thin sections. And I have very good evidence of like broken stems that have like sort of remained, like that have like fossilized in the soil, some events of clearing, some events of tilling, and more importantly, events of like water moving within the channels. So we have very strong evidence now that they're not keeping the water in, they're draining the soil. In terms of like sort of the human occupation, it's an area that hasn't been really excavated, as pretty much like the second or third person has been excavating there. And I found some small evidence of like some form of like structures, way smaller, less developed, but platforms around like sort of some form of like plaza, that's how I'm interpreting it, but smaller settlements along the river, so at a certain distance. One of the things when I was like mapping like these, again, like, you know, I had to clear the forest, I had to like burn everything around it to be able to look at it. But you can see like the complexity of the systems, like how there's like a system of double canal. I definitely have like, you know, the suspicion that there was like some sort of just some dam. Like, so they were like really, this is connected to the river, and then they're separating the water in like two different canals. Why are they doing that? I have no idea. And they're moving water into this reservoir. But the problem here is like the interpretation, and this is where like, you know, I can present all this empirical data, but there is like a bitter argument. There's like two very clear groups. Like there's a group that says, okay, well, this political integration, there's no more discussions. Like this is it. Obviously, this is state, and all like these systems are working in tandem together. Everything is like perfectly nice. This is like, you know, paradise in Amazonia, and the fields, like the villages, like the mountains, everything is connected in one single system. And it's, you know, the proof that there's a state. Whereas other people argue against this and say like, no. There are very clear differences in these different areas. Their culture is different. You may have like some authority on one side of the river, but on the other side of the river, you know, it is cooperation. This is anarchy. This is an anarchic society. And it's just like cooperation and people draining the swamp together. And on top of that, like the systems look complex just because they are a palimpsest. They're like different iterations of something. It's not necessarily one single event. That was the limits of like my knowledge. This is sort of like the point where we stalled, where I think like, you know, archaeologists don't have much more to say. We need more evidence, we need more dating, we need more excavation, but we have to entertain some ideas about like what's going to happen, like what happened, what does this mean? It was then when I finished like my master's and I finished my dissertation that my supervisor suggested me very kindly to stop looking at these and move to a different area. And I moved to Cambridge, Canada. And the reason my supervisor like told me to go to Cambridge is because of like these characteristics of this particular landscape. It's also a landscape that is flooded constantly and historically has been flooded. But the difference is that we have written records about like how this happened. And so I can fill up like these gaps. In the other part, I don't have anything but the monuments, so I don't know exactly what happened. And what I've been doing in the past years is just sort of compiling these, working, like trying to understand what was the history, the actual history of draining this particular swamp. So for those who were in Cambridge, so we are right here, like this is the University of Cambridge, and the Fens is an area very similar to sort of like the Netherlands. It's some places is below sea level. And it's an area that has been heavily modified through history. The Romans were like invested in making canals. Then the Saxons actually developed a very strangely similar system of drain fields, right? For which we actually, one of the interesting things that my supervisor was telling me at that point is that we speculate a lot about like the size of the fields, but here in this area, we have records that show that the size of the fields had to do more with the property regime than anything practical. It was the size that was allotted for family and so definitely an interesting question to ask. And I think more importantly, there was when I was like surveying, I was like taking to this remote part of the forest that I could not clear. It's impossible. But when my guides told me, like took me there was like this immense canal. It was enormous. It was impossible to photograph because it was so huge. And it just went directly into the river. And one of the things that I learned when I was like doing like sort of my PhD in Cambridge was like this megalomaniac drainage project that was the construction of what is called like the Bedford Levels. And what they did is, well, they literally straightened the rivers, and they built a straight canal from Erie to almost Kings Lynn. And if you look in Google Earth, you'll see it's like this straight river, and there's like two straight canals, and in the middle there's an area where like water like overflows. And by doing that, what they did was like completely drain it. Now, the Romans attempted to drain it. The Saxons attempted to drain it with, some success. But the interesting thing about this particular sort of landscape was that is the continuity. The fens were drained finally in 1650, and it was like it was the important work of Dutch engineer with Bermuden, and the collaboration of Charles the First and the Earl of Bedford. And the history of how they got together and how they were obsessed on draining the swamp, I think is one of has been helping me quite a lot to put these things into context and just maybe imagine what would be the questions we should be asking. More importantly, and maybe something that archaeologists never really, when we're thinking about political integration, I feel like one of the things that we forget is who dug the channels? And I think there's a lot of information I'm getting from this sort of next phase of research in which just trying to pick up these stories on who were the people who actually had to go there and make this insane canal. And obviously you have the people what was working for Bermuda, right? But I think one of the things that for me was more interesting is a lot of it was done with slave labor that was taken by Oliver Cromwell from Scotland, and other prisoners that were taken from different parts in the fights with the Netherlands, and they would just put them to dig canals. The other thing that I found fascinating from the history of the fence, sort of the rich sort of documents from the fence, is that, and I really like what this author Astbury has to say about it, is that drainage programs have only one, dredging projects have only one thing in common, right? It's everybody disagrees about them. It's not something that you can really do without political authority. And in the fence, that was the case. There were several attempts, because obviously by draining the swamp, you're affecting the livelihood of people there that depend on fishing or fowling. And there are many instances where the work was sabotaged. And there's a group, there's the history of these groups that I'm trying to chase down now, that are called the Fen Tigers. They were sort of a guerrilla group that was determined to not only stop Bermuda, but it was destroying the dams in order to prevent this to happen. So this is pretty much where I'm going, some of the ideas. Again, it's very difficult for me to conclude something about what's happening there with the Mahos that was there where I was working before. I think there are more sort of cases about sort of these drainage projects that are I feel are as important as sort of monumental architecture, in order to better interpret what was the process of developing these landscapes in pre-modern times, modern and pre-modern times. I think this connects very well with the talk that Leo was talking about, was giving us last time. My dissertation ends with this fantastic piece of fascist art that it comes from. It was made for the time they were draining the swamps near Rome. It's called the Pontine Marshes, and for me, it's when I looked at these, I have to put this in my dissertation because it's too good. Because you see, the people who are defending the strength of the nation and the canals on the other side. And it was accompanied by a speech that Benito Mussolini gave, during the time of the draining of the canteen marshes. And in the speech, he said, this is the war the black shirts want to fight, the war for bread. And that's sort of how I close my dissertation. I mean, I'm not claiming that people in Amazonia were probably fascists, but I think it's definitely something we have to take into account what kind of questions we have to do, and we have to make, and how can we peel these landscapes when we don't have any text to refer to. So yeah, well, that's pretty much it. I hope I didn't go too long, but thank you for listening. I'm just waiting for your comments.